Hello, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Andrea Cortinois, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Toronto. And we would like to welcome you to the first of a series of 4 lectures on land, borders, and health. First, we would like to acknowledge the land we are on, at least those of us who are in Toronto today. We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Mississauga of the New Credit First Nation, Anishinaabe, Wendat, Huron, and Haudenosaunee Indigenous people on which the University of Toronto now stands. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon, One Poon Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Rockies Confederacy and Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We would also like to pay our respects to all our ancestors and to our present elders and knowledge keepers. We reflect on the colonialism, broken treaties, forced displacement, genocide, state-sanctioned oppression, violence, racism, and injustices perpetrated against Indigenous peoples over hundreds of years and ongoing today, as we discuss human-human and human-environment relations and the urgent need to rediscover a balanced relationship with our planet. Let us be honest about our complicity in upholding the status quo, which perpetuates violence and exclusion. And let us honor our responsibility to change at the individual, institutional, and systemic level. No better day to kickstart this lecture series than Earth Day, but instead of thinking about financial investments and what private businesses should do to save the planet, which is the official theme for this year's Earth Day, with this series we want to seriously think about how to understand and move beyond the multiple hierarchies of racial, patriarchal, and androcentric violence that shape our relationship with Mother Earth and with each other, our well-being and very survival. And no better speaker to start this lecture series than Harsha Walia, having read more than once both of her books, knowing how insightful and deeply researched and powerful her critique of racial capitalism and racist nationalism is, and knowing her commitment to the effort to systematically debunk the many myths that hide the truths on migration, I have no doubts that her lecture will deeply challenge the views of those of you who have not been lucky enough to meet her before. I would like to introduce our host and moderator for today, Dr. Vanessa Reddit. Dr. Reddit is a family doctor at the Crossroads Clinic in Toronto, where she cares for newly arrived refugees and climates. She's also a lecturer in the Department of Family and Community Medicine and at the Dalla School of Public Health, University of Toronto. As Dr. Reddit has clinical responsibilities at the same time as this lecture, there is a chance that she could be suddenly called away, in which case I'll do my best to help. And finally, the lectures will be recorded and the recordings will be made available through the website of the Dalla School of Public Health. So welcome you all again, and Vanessa, please.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be introducing Harsha Walia today. She's formally trained in the law and is the award-winning author of Border and Rule, Global Migration, Capitalism, and the Rise of Racist Nationalism, and also Undoing Border Imperialism. She's been involved in community-based grassroots migrant justice, feminist, anti-racist, Indigenous solidarity, anti-capitalist, Palestinian liberation, and anti-imperialist movements for 2 decades. Her incisive writing, research, and unwavering activism have influenced so many of us, and we're so grateful that she's joined us today to frame our discussion about borders. To quote from her book, Border and Rule, "Our era's migration crisis is not marked by human mobility, but rather the reality of mass displacement and immobility produced by the multifarious and interwoven systems of globalized capitalism, imperialism, and climate catastrophe." This is such a critical conversation, and even more so as the dynamics of exploitation and exclusion of migrants have been so painfully amplified during the pandemic. Harsha's talk will be followed by about 30 minutes of question and answer, so please put your questions into the Q&A function. And with that, thank you again, Harsha, for joining us, and I'll turn over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for hosting. Thank you for everyone who is sharing your time so we can be in this conversation together. I'm really looking forward to the discussion, so I'll try to keep my talk short. I want to start by saying that I'm on the unceded, unsurrendered territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations, Indigenous peoples and nations who continue to steward the land. And thank you for the contextualizing of what Earth Day has become and its deeply capitalist colonial origins, and really what it should mean, right? Which is land back and Indigenous jurisdiction over the lands that we live on. And in this conversation about land, borders, and health, of course, so crucial for us to be thinking about the ways in which colonialism has deeply, completely, deliberately impacted the health of Indigenous peoples, right? That is the project of settler colonialism is a project of genocide, and that is very much a health issue. For folks who are unfamiliar, and I believe he's also on the call, I would just so highly recommend Samir Shaheen Hussein's book, Fighting for a Hand to Hold, which really looks at confronting medical colonialism against Indigenous people and children specifically in Canada. And one of the important pieces of this work that he's done so necessarily, and I'll talk about a few other things, is that just the ways in which it moves us beyond the framework of social determinants of health, right? So of course, a lot of kind of mainstream progressive discourses around health and medicine get kind of framed or limited really around social determinants of health, which really is, the idea that, of course, health is produced by social, environmental, economic, and social factors, that is one of the primary determinants of one's health. But really one of the limitations of that framework is that it kind of treats health and the medical system as something that's downstream, right? As, the healthcare providers, as the inheritors of a system that produces negative health outcomes. But what Samir's work does so brilliantly is squarely locate medical colonialism and the medical industrial complex as a whole in the context of capitalism and colonialism as an active producer of social determinants of health, right? And so to implicate the ways in which sterilization, medical policies of apartheid, of segregation, of active anti-Indigenous racism as producing negative health outcomes for Indigenous peoples. And of course, Samir's work exists alongside so much critical work by Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities. And I just want to point out something that is, if people haven't already read it, to really look at the National Inquiry on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and trans and two-spirit people, Reclaiming Power and Place, which is the final report of the National Inquiry. And what is, I think, amongst many things, so important about the National Inquiry's final report is not only did it, as we know, name violence against Indigenous women and girls and trans and two-spirit people explicitly as genocide, right? That this violence is not simply interpersonal violence, but that it is produced by colonial gendered violence. It is produced by settler colonialism. It is produced by policies such as the Indian Act, by a legacy of residential schools that continues today through child apprehension, that continues today through racism in the health sector, but that it specifically names as one of the pillars of violence against Indigenous women and girls and trans and two-spirit people as the healthcare system. And I want to just briefly quote from the National Inquiry, and again, really encourage everybody, practitioners and people, to be reading the National Inquiry's report, right? This is central to the ways in which all of us need to understand what's happening. And so they write in the National Inquiry, and I'll quote briefly, quote, "Colonial violence directed towards cultural practice, family, and community creates conditions that increase the likelihood of other forms of violence, including interpersonal violence, through its distinct impacts on the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual health of Inuit, First Nations, and Métis peoples. In sharing stories about the health issues they or their murdered and missing loved ones faced, and the experiences they had in seeking health services, family members and survivors illustrated how addressing violence against Indigenous women, girls, and trans and two-spirit people must also address their right to health." And just briefly skipping ahead, the federal government's current approach to health programs and services for Indigenous peoples is that there exists no statutory or treaty obligation to provide health services for status Indian people. Nevertheless, it has taken responsibility for providing supplementary services for some First Nations and Inuit, but not Métis, where provincial services are not available. It is the federal government's position that these programs and services do not flow from a rights-based perspective, but from a policy mandate. This mandate includes recognition of, but is not based in, human or Indigenous rights instruments. We situate violence as a health issue. Interpersonal violence directed against First Nations, Inuit, and Métis women, girls, and trans and two-spirit people is one of the most significant health impacts associated with the colonial violence of residential schools, family separation, relocation, dispossession of land, and for First Nations, the Indian Act. These factors, throughout the testimony, witnesses courageously offered often difficult testimony that explained the impact on their health of acts of physical violence, sexual assault, and childhood physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. In many cases, the effort survivors take to cope with the traumatic impact of this violence, often in the absence of other culturally relevant supports, can create additional health problems. Isolation, addiction, self-harm, and suicide are all common health-related challenges that Indigenous women, girls, and trans and two-spirit people confront in the aftermath of violence or in the aftermath of violently assisting a loved one. These factors all increase the risk of further violence. I'll stop there. I could, say so much more and quote so much more, but really want to emphasize how crucial it is that when we're thinking through borders and health and colonialism and more and the lands, that we're squarely looking at the ways in which colonial violence not only inhibits access to services and access to health, but actively, again, produces negative health outcomes. And really, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore names it, a life of premature death, right? So Ruth Wilson Gilmore, in her definition, she's a Black abolitionist. Please check out her work if you haven't. She talks and names and defines systemic racism as the extrajudicial conditions that create premature death, right? And that is precisely what colonialism and capitalism produce through white supremacy, racism, caste apartheid, and more, is premature death, which is so squarely and fundamentally an issue for those of us who are concerned with health. And so I want to move on from there and looking at, or not move on, but extend on and think about what this means within the context of Canada also for migrant workers and refugees and non-status people, and how similarly borders are also sites of violence and death. This juxtaposition of thinking about healthcare specifically in Canada, and I think is so crucial. I know this is a much broader kind of framework around land, borders, and health, but I really want to focus in on what this means in the Canadian context for a range of reasons. That's where I'm located, but also because we know that one of the ways in which Canada is lauded in the kind of global arena, in the international arena, is because of its universal healthcare, right? Is the idea of universal healthcare. And of course, universal healthcare is what we actually need and what we deserve, right? What every single person deserves is universal and equitable access to healthcare. But in thinking through the experiences, not only and not exclusive of, but particularly of Indigenous peoples and healthcare in Canada, and of non-status migrant and refugee peoples in Canada and those communities, it kind of unravels a lot of the myth of universal healthcare, right? And we start to see that the so-called promise of universal healthcare is so limited, not only in its scope of service, if you will, but the ways in which it actively reproduces various kinds of systemic oppression, particularly as it relates to racial citizenship and racial capitalism. So one of the most striking examples, I think, in thinking about and understanding the ways in which the healthcare is complicit in the violence of borders is the issue of medical deportation. If people can drop in the chat, if you don't mind, if you've ever heard of what medical deportation in Canada looks like, or even know what it means, just, throw in there. I don't know if the chat's enabled or not, but I'd love to know if we and you have an understanding of what medical deportation is. And of course, no judgment if you don't, because that's the reality of medical deportation in Canada, is that it is such a hidden reality, right? That most people don't even know it's existing, including many in the healthcare sector, because a lot of this is the kind of seemingly bureaucratic administrative violence, the death by 1,000 cuts of the way that a lot of violence works. And so what medical deportation in Canada is the practice of deporting people who are often, and more often than not, legally in Canada, but are deported because of a healthcare condition. And this most starkly impacts migrant workers. So migrant workers are workers who are in Canada, more often than not as temporary workers. So if you know or are familiar with farm workers or domestic care workers, many of them are not permanent residents in Canada. What they are is what we know is the temporary foreign worker programs, various streams of it. And it is a myth that Canada accepts a large number of immigrants, right? Like the very common myth of Canada that's been going on for decades is that Canada accepts so many immigrants, that we're a multicultural haven. But for the past several decades, when we're talking about the kinds of immigrants that Canada accepts, it's mostly temporary migrant workers. And what temporary migrant workers are is essentially a pool of labor to serve in large capitalist industries like the farms and fields, also in the homes of middle class and rich Canadians in the case of domestic workers. And when their labor is no longer needed, they're essentially removed from Canada. So in the case of migrant farm workers, we have in Canada migrant farm workers who have been coming for 3 generations, going back to the 60s, primarily from the Caribbean and Mexico, and now increasingly from Central America and elsewhere, where migrant workers have been coming for 3 generations, grandfather, father, and son, who've been toiling and working, picking our grapes, picking our berries, producing our wheat, all of our agricultural needs, literally everything we put into our mouths. The chances is that it was grown and picked by a migrant farm worker who works in Canada, who lives in Canada, but has no right to remain in Canada, again, for generations. And as we know, farm work is one of the most dangerous jobs. We're told that policing is one of the most dangerous jobs in Canada. It's not. It's construction work and farms and farming work, right? Working with pesticides, working with heavy machinery. And that is, of course, this is a tangent, but that's some of the ways in which the propaganda of policing is produced, right? Is to tell us that that is a hard job, a dangerous job, but it's actually these working class jobs that are majoritarily done by immigrant workers. And so what medical deportation is the issue of migrant workers who get injured on the job in Canadian farms, in the case of migrant farm workers. And then because they are no longer able to work, they're no longer able to work for their employers, they're no longer able to serve the function of producing labor for racial capitalism under conditions of cheap labor, that they are deported. And I'll give an example of this. And this is, one of many, many cases, but the situation of Sheldon McKinsey, who was a Jamaican man who had been coming to Canadian farms for over 12 years. Sheldon McKinsey was working on a farm in Leamington. Leamington is known as Canada's tomato capital, where most of Canada's tomatoes are produced, including organic tomatoes, right? So even in thinking about Earth Day and thinking about healthy food production, it's so important to recognize that even the food that we consider more healthy and organic and free of pesticides and better for the earth doesn't necessarily mean that it is not embedded in extractive and exploitative labor relations. And so Sheldon was working on a farm in Leamington when he sustained a severe injury in 2015 on the job, leaving him in a coma. While he was on life support in Ontario, on life support, he was stripped of his work visa and his healthcare coverage as Canada attempted to deport him while on life support. And in farm worker, with just looking at farm workers, right? Like not looking at all of the other sectors where migrant workers are working, just at the sector of farm workers in just Ontario. In the period of 10 years, there were at least 787 documented medical deportations, like those that were attempted with Sheldon McKinsey. And in the case of Sheldon, it was only after his cousin, Marcia Barrett, launched a huge public advocacy campaign that his deportation was temporarily delayed, right? Because again, most people don't even know that medical deportation is happening. So it was only after his cousin had a massive public campaign that his deportation was temporarily delayed. And then he passed away shortly thereafter, 9 months later, in September 2015, leaving behind his wife and daughters. And so this is the ubiquitous reality of the medical system when it comes to migrant farm workers, right? So again, those who are brought into Canada, right, by the Canadian state. This isn't just an issue of a few bad employers. This is a mass program of hundreds of thousands of workers and immigrants who are brought into Canada specifically to perform cheap labor, right? There is nothing low-skilled about this work. This is dangerous, hard work. People are working up to 15 hours a day. And as you can imagine, what makes their labor cheap is not their lack of skill, but it is the social and political conditions that force workers into cheapened labor, right? So if you, as a migrant worker, ever try to raise concerns about health and safety conditions, you not only fear facing termination from the job, because migrant workers are largely ununionized, for example, but you also then fear deportation, right? So we see how termination and deportation are working in tandem. So this is not an anomaly. This is the perfected model. Like Canada on the global level, at UN tables, at tables on the international arena, at the United Nations, in conversations around international labor migration, Canada is seen as the model. Canada is seen as the model for having perfected a system where Canada can benefit from cheap labor, where capital interests can benefit from cheap labor without these workers ever having the privilege or the access to Canadian citizenship, right? To the right to permanent residency, the right to universal health care, the right to access social assistance, the right to housing, all of those things that on paper flow from citizenship. So this is so important to understand about Canada's perception of universal healthcare and the reason that Canada is actually lauded on policy tables. It's because Canada has perfected a model of what in international circles is called managed migration, right? Where you manage your migration in such a way that you can extract labor without ensuring the rights for people whose labor you are extracting. So in this case, overwhelmingly migrant workers coming from countries in the global south. And here, in thinking about land and in thinking about borders, it is so crucial to think about why so many people are on the move in the first place, right? Like, why are there so many immigrants? It can become really easy to fall into the trap of saying, oh, well, you know, we can't accept all these immigrants. What's going to happen to our healthcare system? That's ironically one of the tropes or one of the myths that is often used against migrants and refugees, right? Like, we don't have enough resources and services. And of course, there's many responses to that. One is that, you know, the idea of scarcity of resources is actually the logic of austerity. You know, we know that there is actually enough money and enough wealth, not only in Canada, but really around the world to feed everybody, right? We know that. But the reason is that poverty and impoverishment is not a coincidence alongside extreme wealth. It is actually a coincidence. It is actually the consequence, right? Like, poverty only exists alongside massive wealth. It can only exist. People can only have immense amount of wealth because other people have been impoverished, right? So the only reason that one of the richest people in Canada is, you know, not ironically also a farm owner, is because these farm owners can extract the labor of migrant farm workers, right? And that is true across the board of CEOs. You know, in Canada, the average, the richest CEOs in Canada make more in the first 2 days in a year than the average working person makes in the whole year, right? And that's not just because, you know, rich people somehow work more or smarter, right? That's not the case. It's because you inherit wealth. It's because you extract wealth. And it's because you invest in wealth, right? You make everything into a commodity. Housing's become a commodity. You can literally do no work, buy a house, and suddenly it's worth more because that has become a commodity. So there is nothing about the system of capitalism that is about equity. It actually produces massive inequality, massive wealth gaps by design. And so when we're thinking about, you know, one of the returning to these myths that we can't accept more immigrants or refugees because that will be a drain on our system, it's because we have created a system. And by us, I don't mean those of us in this room. I mean, you know, the powers that be, the elite, have created a system where we all believe in the logic of scarcity, right? We all think that there's not enough money for our healthcare system. There's not enough money for a universal pharmacare system. There's not enough money for clean water, for food, for living wage, for healthcare, for education, for childcare. But that's not true. There is enough money. We just are in a system that, for example, actually taxes working class people more proportionately than rich people. We're in a system where we give billions of dollars of subsidies to oil and gas companies, right? Canada has a massive subsidy when it comes to oil and gas, including the Alberta tar sands, which is a major health disaster. We give more money to the police, to prisons, to the military, to border enforcement than we do to social services. So this is a matter of political priorities, but immigrants are the first to be scapegoated in the logic of austerity, right? And one of the slogans that I love is that our enemy arrives in a limousine, not on a boat, right? That we have to remember that our solidarity needs to be with struggling people and not with the elite. But the other reason that we have to refute and rebuff these kinds of arguments of like, you know, we're not responsible for immigrants, is that it really erases the complicity, right? How do immigrants even get produced? What compels somebody to move from their home? There's many reasons. I don't want to simplify or generalize, but we have to understand that there is a historic and contemporary reality of racism, of white supremacy, of imperialism, of colonialism, of economic impoverishment, all of these factors, this long, long legacy of colonialism that never ended, right? We're not in a post-colonial era. This long arc of colonialism continues in so many different forms. And, you know, Walter Rodney, who wrote, you know, seminal works around Pan-Africanism, reminds us that the so-called global South is not, you know, the third world by chance. It was actively underdeveloped, right? The global South only exists in relationship to the global North, not as a geographic site, right? There's no global South. That's not a place on a map. It's a construct, and that construct exists only in relationship to the global North. So the poverty of the global South exists only in relationship to the global North having extracted, enslaved, indentured, and plundered in places in the global South, right? So that's that same arc of exploitation that I was just talking about earlier, right? That is parallel to capitalism and connected to capitalism. So how is this all related? Is that when we're thinking about the ways in which borders function and how immigrants are produced, how refugees are produced, we have to see how Canada, all of us, become complicit in the displacement of peoples that makes them into refugees. I'm going to tell a quick story that I hope will tie this bow up of the point that I'm trying to make. So, you know, years ago, again, drop in the chat if you've heard of the show Border Security. Actually, I don't know if there's a chat because I didn't see, maybe it was in the Q&A. If you've heard of the show Border Security. And so Border Security was this show that was running on the air. It was kind of like an embedded cop show, very similar if you were, you know, born in the last century, I guess. You'd be familiar with this cop show called Cop. Cops, which used to run on terrible Fox News, a right-wing propaganda show. And Border Security was a show produced in Canada that was a similar law enforcement glorifying embedded TV reality show, where basically a production team was embedded in with Canada Border Services Agency. So Canada Border Service Agency is Canada's immigration enforcement arm, basically. And so I didn't actually know about this show until one day we got a call, a number of us who were part of an organizing group called No One Is Illegal, we got a call from a number of people who said that they witnessed a raid, an immigration raid happening on a construction site, coming back to, dangerous immigrant work in Vancouver, the city where I live. And, they were surprised and shocked and disturbed, not only by the raid, but that there was like massive amounts of film crews filming this immigration raid as it was happening. So that's how I first learned about the show. And a number of primarily Central American men were picked up in this immigration raid that was, then being filmed for broadcast. And we, got in touch with a number of their family members. We got in touch with a number of the men who were then detained by Canada Border Services Agency. And so, when we talked to them on the phone, we asked them, right, like what happened? And so they were all undocumented, what Canada calls so-called illegals. And I'm going to return to this concept of illegals after the story. And so, they were so-called illegals, but undocumented people, which means that you're in Canada without legal authorization. So they had come as refugees, they had failed their refugee process and had become undocumented. And so we asked them, what's your story, right? Like in the media, you're just going to be painted, as many people are, in dehumanizing ways as so-called illegals, without any sense of your humanity, of, why you came to Canada, what's your story? The media is just going to splash you with this narrative of failed asylum seeker, deport them, get them out fast. But we want to know, right? Like we want to know what your story is. And so two of the men told us that they were cousins, and they had come to Canada because they were living in a village in Honduras where a Canadian mining company operated. And this Canadian mining company, you can Google notorious mining companies in Honduras. I'll save you the work. It's called Goldcorp. But Goldcorp is in Honduras. Goldcorp is around the world. Goldcorp actually funds, ironically or maybe unironically, a lot of health-related services in Canada, including, for example, substance use treatment centers and such. But this is blood money, right? Because Goldcorp is a notorious mining company who is actually destroying the land and the health of people around the world by extracting, poisoning the land, ruining Indigenous communities' access to their lands and what mining produces. And Canada and Vancouver, where I live, is actually headquarters to 75% of the world's mining companies, right? So Canada, again, we think of as peaceful and peacekeeping, but really Canadian mining companies are notorious for their human rights and environmental records around the world, Goldcorp in Honduras being one of them. And so they were affected, and their extended family was affected by this mining company in Honduras. And not only that, they believed that there was a targeted killing of one of their family members who was opposing this mine. There's been, of course, as with a lot of human rights records of mining companies around the world, there's often what is believed to be targeted assassinations and paramilitary targeting of dissidents, right? And so they fled and came to Canada because they feared for their life. They had lost their livelihood, their land and their village had been destroyed, and they were forced to enter into the wage economy. So they had done that in some cities throughout Central America until they eventually made their way to Canada. When they arrived in Canada, they were like, we're fleeing for our lives. What do? They go to, an immigration consultant or an immigration lawyer, one or both. And they got the advice, the very normal, unfortunately normal advice that, you are never going to be accepted as a refugee in Canada if you tell the story, right? Canada's never going to accept that it is effectively responsible for your displacement, right? That's never going to happen. So we suggest that you tell a different story. So they told a different story, which is the tired, tested, true trope of narco trafficking, right? Like the ways in which particularly Central America gets folded into this discourse of narco trafficking, organized crime, as if though, again, we're not complicit in the drug war itself, right? The ways in which capitalism and colonialism has created the drug war, both globally and of course, locally with the toxic drug supply that is killing people every single day in our cities and in this country. And so again, this global loop of violence. But so they told this tired, trusted, true story of narco trafficking, of organized crime, and they were found not to be credible. They weren't believed, which, wasn't their story, right? And they expressed that they were hesitant about telling the story, but it was the advice they got. And it's true, again, they would never be accepted. They were never to be accepted by Canada's Immigration and Refugee Board if they told a story about the violence that they were fleeing by a Canadian mining company. So then they failed the refugee process. They became undocumented and they were working in the invisible, exploitative, low-wage economy of construction work in Canada when this raid happened. And so that was their story, right? Like that is one of so many stories of how not only do people become illegal, but how Canada becomes complicit in creating displacement and so-called illegality in the first place, right? Like this isn't just a problem over there. We are bound up often in these violences. And, that's just one example of, one family and one mining company. But we can think about all the Canadian mining companies. We can think about all the free trade agreements Canada has signed. We can think about the effects of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, the world's largest free trade agreement that Canada is a part of. We can think about war and occupation like Afghanistan and elsewhere. And then we can start to see, right, how we become caught up in this web of violence, and that it is these asymmetries of violence, right, that the majority of the world's displaced. Again, it's not a coincidence that the majority of the world's displaced are those who are in the so-called global South, those who are Black and brown, those who are caste oppressed, primarily women and children, right? Like these are the asymmetries and the lines, the fault lines of power and oppression in the world that also are the fault lines of migration and displacement. So not only do we have Canada complicit in then, creating a part of the world's migration crisis, what we know of as the migration crisis, but also then becomes complicit in constricting people's mobility, right? By saying you can't come here as a permanent resident, you're going to come here as a temporary worker. We're not going to believe, your refugee story. We're only going to accept you around these very narrow definitions, right? And then you become a failed refugee. But then also is this question of illegality. And like I said, I wanted to come back to this because here's the thing, right? When we think about so-called illegal immigrants, there's a number of things that we can and should parse out about that. It becomes too easy to say, illegal immigrants don't belong here. They don't have a right to our services. And again, not only does that ignore our complicity, not only does that ignore that actually there is enough, it's a matter of political priorities, but there's also a discursive logic of control in that, right? Like, how does someone become illegal? There's nothing, we're not born illegal, right? There's no such thing. Laws create illegality, right? Laws create and determine who is illegal. So every time that Canada changes its laws, the categories of so-called illegals change, right? There's nothing natural about it. It's a matter of who's in power and what kind of laws they pass that then expand the web of illegality. And, for example, in the post 9/11 era, the web of illegality has expanded because suddenly, we're worried that everyone's a so-called terrorist who's visibly Muslim. Black and brown Muslim people are overwhelmingly targeted. Sikh people are overwhelmingly targeted and also on Canada's terrorist list, right? So that expands the possibility of you suddenly becoming illegal. So part of it is that it's completely legally arbitrary. I'm trained in the law, and the law is so arbitrary and such a function of power, the way that health is. But also there's a racial logic to it, right? So when we think of who is an illegal immigrant, we're always automatically in our minds trained to think that those people are Black and brown people, right? That we don't actually know people's legal status. But if we were to think of who's an illegal, the image that's conjured up in our minds is a racial one. And I'm not suggesting that we're all racist, but that's the reality of white supremacy at work, right? Of how we're conditioned with these biases. And obviously that media produces as well, right? And it's textbook and everything, right? We're trained to believe in these. And the reality is that, you know, in British Columbia, the province where I reside, until fairly recently, the largest number of people who were on visas that were unauthorized. So either they had overstayed their visas, like the two cousins that I mentioned. So they were on a you know, say a visitor visa, but then overstayed their visas. They stayed longer than they should have, or were working, but were on a visitor visa. So, you know, on a visitor visa, you're not allowed to work in Canada. So they were working under the table illegally. So basically, you know, various categories of so-called illegals until recently in British Columbia were white Australians. White Australians in Canada's ski resort industry, service industry, hospitality industry. Anyone who's here in BC will know what I'm talking about, right? But that is never what is conjured up, even in BC, of who's a so-called illegal, because it is a completely racialized construct, right? It has nothing to do with the actual law. And that's actually also the same in the United States. So, you know, in the US, similarly, the media constructs so-called illegals as largely Mexicans and Central Americans. But the largest nationality of visa overstays in the United States is Canadians, right? But that, you know, if it's even brought up, is treated as an injustice, right? If there's ever a story of a Canadian who's detained in the United States or an Australian facing deportation from Canada, it's a story of grave injustice, right? Of bureaucratic injustice, of like, look, this person's just working here, let them live their life, they're contributing. So there's something so deep that we have to interrogate about the border, that it has very little to do with law and order, that it has very little to do with safety, it has very little to do with the law as we know it, and everything to do with racial citizenship, everything to do with maintaining racial capitalism, right? To ensure not only that people are excluded and deported and detained, but that we create a condition of deportability so that labor can be extracted. You know, again, migrant workers being a prime case in point. So that is the ways in which the border functions, that we have to destabilize the normalcy of the border, the assumption that the border just exists as a map on a line. Borders are constantly shifting. Their very creation is so deeply tied up in colonialism, right? Partitions of so many places is a function of divide and rule and conquer. And we really need to blow open the ways in which we think about immigration, right? So we're not just thinking about, oh, how many people do we accept, or how many is too many, or can we afford these services, but that we're really expansively thinking about how immigration itself is so tied up in why people are forced to move. How are people's lands being decimated? How is the earth being decimated? How is militarism destroying and poisoning the land? How is capitalism destroying and extracting from the earth constantly? Like, we know, right? Like, we know that the climate apocalypse is not like in the future, it's in the now, right? Where entire countries and places are drowning, are facing famine, and the climate refugees that are being produced as a result of this system are now facing increasingly militarized borders, right? And that's one of the last points I want to make before I show a brief movie, or a brief short clip, which is, you know, the ways in which we need to, in the future, in the now and in the future, be thinking about the relationship between land, borders, and health, is really the issue of climate displacement, right? Right now, around the world, the fastest growing form of displacement is climate displacement. So new displacements, what, you know, in kind of international speak is called new displacements. The ratio of new displacements caused by climate-induced disasters, weather, drought, famine, flooding, etc., they outpace new displacements caused by what's kind of the traditional, if you will, definition of political persecution by at least a ratio of 3 to 1. 3 to 1. So it's the fastest growing form of displacement on the planet today. And we know, as you know, in the opening remarks were said so well, that, days like Earth Day, there's no fix to the earth, the destruction of the earth that can be achieved under capitalism and colonialism, right? Like, we can't tweak our way through this. We need to radically rethink how we're going to be living in relationship to the earth. Indigenous peoples steward 80% of the world's biodiversity. And we know that Indigenous peoples and land defenders are on the front line of defending the land, and are also on the front line of facing political violence for defending the land around the world, right? I'm, again, in the province of British Columbia, Wet'suwet'en land defenders have every single year faced a militarized raid for defending their land against a fracked gas pipeline. The Trans Mountain Pipeline, which Canada bought, right? Like a sinking financial investment that the Canadian government decided the federal government was then going to take responsibility for, is also being fought here on these lands by the Tsleil-Waututh, by the Secwepemc, right? So, and around the world, this pattern is the same, of Indigenous land defenders around the world being on the front lines of fighting this extraction, of defending the land, of fighting for the health of their communities, the food security of their communities, the right to life of their communities, the right to life of the planet, but are facing the most militaristic violence, right? Indigenous land defense is one of the fastest growing forms of political repression around the world, right? So targeted assassinations and more of Indigenous land defenders, their imprisonment and targeted assassinations and deaths. And so as this is happening, more and more people are being displaced from their lands, and climate refugees, who are the human face of this destruction, are not being welcomed, right? They're facing more militarized borders. And countries like Canada, countries like the United States, countries in the European Union, countries like Australia, they have gone from kind of like outright climate denial, because that's no longer possible, to now using this ideology of climate security. And climate security is this new burgeoning, growing field of basically treating climate issues as a national security threat. And climate refugees are right in the middle of that, where climate refugees are now seen as a national security threat, as a threat to scarce resources, as the water wars. Climate refugees are caught up in, because now that logic of austerity is expanding and extending even more in the climate crisis, right? Like, not only do we not have enough money and services, but now we don't have enough resources, when in fact we know we do. It's just most of it's being polluted. And so climate refugees are now facing militarized borders, and a lot of countries, and Canada is starting to look at this, they're starting to deploy special border enforcement units focused on deterring climate refugees, because they know that there's going to be more and more boats. There's going to be more and more people trying to flee towards safety, right? People already are. But the world does not actually accept climate refugees. There is no even legal basis for most climate refugees to claim refugee status based on climate displacement, which loops back to the story of the two cousins, right? What story are they going to have to tell to be accepted? Even though climate devastation is a reality, they're not going to be able to tell that story. And most refugees, in fact, all refugees around the world who have attempted to claim refugee status on the basis of climate displacement have been denied, because there is no definition of climate refugees, right? So that is an issue that is so squarely connected to land and borders and health that we're here to talk about. And I just want to show a quick video.
In 1987, Diana's parents applied for refugee status in Canada, where she and her two siblings were born. In the late 1990s, Diana's father was refused a work permit, making him undocumented, even though the government admitted he was unable to be deported. He was in a state of complete limbo, without legal status or access to services. 2 decades later, he became sick.
I was 22, 23 when I had to start advocating for him and try to, get everybody to start helping him. For a couple of years, we had no answers at all. Yeah. Everybody was saying, no, we've never heard of this before. We don't know how to help your dad. Not even government officials knew what to do with my dad. They just said, he's in limbo. Too bad, so sad. Which I found to be ridiculous, because they were the policymakers. And I was just stressed out, trying to graduate university, trying to work full time, or part-time and also trying to help my dad at the same time. It felt like it was 3 full-time jobs, plus my family didn't know how to help me, so I felt really alone. And then finally, eventually somebody got back to me and said, okay, we can issue you a 3-month interim federal health certificate. And so we got that. I was so thankful for the 3 months. We actually got his a proper diagnosis. So he did have cancer, and he had also COPD, which is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. He was very sick. And I think with that, we were able to, at the BC Cancer Agency, we were able to get him a couple treatments of radiation. And then finally they announced the federal cuts. Jason Kenney announced that they're going to be cutting all the refugee health across Canada. And my dad still needed the services, right? At one point, my dad heard, in the news that inmates in prisons get medical help. He was like, I'm just going to do something drastic. Maybe I'll get placed in there and then maybe I'll get help. I'm like, Dad, you're being crazy. But that's how crazy we got. Yeah, I couldn't leave anywhere, couldn't do anything. It just felt like there's a criminal, trapped in a country where he paid taxes, where his three kids were born, where he worked, where he lived for most of his life. If we had gotten the proper medical attention, at a time when I was trying to fight for him, when the immigration with the government, Canadian government, was basically shunning him, he could have gotten the help he needed. He probably would have still be okay. He passed away last January, so January 2014. Yeah. I feel like I feel like a big part of it was, the Canadian government that really killed my dad.
Cuts to the interim federal health program drastically reduced refugee access to basic health care and remove all health coverage for many refugees, while cutting life-saving health care and over $53 million from immigrant services. Immigration enforcement spending rose by $107 million between 2010 and 2013.
This is a photo of me and my dad. This was his would have been his last birthday. We took him to Cultus Lake that day. It was nice and sunny. Probably one of his happiest moments. I miss him a lot. I miss him every day. I don't want this to happen to anybody else, like it did to my family.
Thank you all for watching that and for honoring Agnes's, or sorry, in this video, she's Diana, her story and her family's. One thing that was so offensive about what the Canadian government did, in addition to the IFH cuts, which most of you know has been reversed now, was that the day after her dad's funeral, an application that we had made for him to remain on humanitarian and compassionate grounds that us and members of her legal team had asked to be expedited because he was so sick and needed healthcare. Canada had refused to expedite his application, just saying he's got to wait in line. He passed away, as she said. And then the day of his funeral, a few days after he died, she got a letter saying his humanitarian and compassionate claim had been accepted after he had passed away, right? And so that is the story of so many people when it comes to what it means to try to live with, health and dignity and safety in Canada. And, this is an older, story's not old, she lives with it every day, but he passed away in 2014, which was almost 8 years ago now. But more recently, and the connection, even just watching now her video, I'm reminded of is, when he used to say, that I want to try to get incarcerated to see if I can get cancer treatments. Right now, a number of us are working with a detainee who's actually detained out east, or he was detained out east. And it was a fight because he actually has been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. He's a migrant detainee that Canada can't deport because the country they're trying to deport him to won't accept him. They're saying he's not a national of that country. So there's, a whole tangle there. And he has stage 4 cancer. And so in advocating for his release on compassionate grounds, right, saying that you can't detain him indefinitely because you don't even know, let alone the fact that you shouldn't be deporting him, but let alone the fact that you can't even figure out where you're trying to deport him to. He needs to be released so he can get healthcare. And the arguments that the lawyers on Canada's side made, written submissions that they made to oppose his detention, was that he would get better healthcare treatment as an incarcerated detainee because he would not be eligible for healthcare should he be released as a non-status person, right? And particularly for, there's a network of doctors who will provide primary care, but it was to undocumented people, but it was impossible to find him treatment. And it took us months to get a number of agencies out here. It ended up being out here in Vancouver that they were able to provide him care. And so he was, recently he flew out to Vancouver and was released on a number of conditions. But it was a fight, and it was just so disgusting and despicable that Canada is actually making the argument that incarcerating somebody is better than releasing them because they will get better healthcare treatment in prison. Just think about that you will have better healthcare treatment in prison, which is a hellhole, right? Than actually releasing them and giving them access to healthcare. Like, that is the devil's choice that people are being forced to make every single day as a result of this immigration system. And so I just wanted to end with that story, and also this additional one that is that I just shared that I'm reminded of, because I just hope that folks can understand that when we're thinking about these ideas conceptually, they really have, of course, the scars of it are born on people every single day who are denied the right to life. And, again, as I stated earlier, what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls premature death, right? The violence of these systems causes premature death. And so our commitment really is one that is a right to life, right? Like, how do we transform and completely, radically transform and change the conditions so that every single person and that this planet itself actually has a right to life? And that requires that we actively fight not only the symptoms of an ill system, but that we actually dismantle the system that is causing death, that is causing destruction, and that we understand that there is not going to be any possibility of a right to life, a right to a good life under capitalism and colonialism and all other systems of oppression, right? That a commitment to health requires a commitment to dismantling all of those systems of oppression. I will leave it at that, and I look forward to conversation. Thank you all for your time and for listening.
Thank you so much, Harsha, for such a brilliant discussion and the way that you weave these different threads together. We will open it up now for questions. So if people have questions, please put them into the chat. And I think that Andrea maybe is going to start off with our first question.
Yes, while we wait for questions, and actually, Harsha, you really like the way you, as Vanessa was saying, are able to bring together things that unfortunately too often are seen as being separate and not related to each other. And I think perhaps the key point that you made that I see is really important to consider is this fact that what happens elsewhere and what happens here are related, that poverty is not a natural phenomenon, it's the result of processes and so on. And with respect to that, maybe I would like to add a couple of very brief things about the examples of agricultural workers that you used. One additional element there is, there are many, but one additional element is the fact that the agricultural products that, for example, workers from Mexico produce in Canada are not just used in Canada, they are also exported back to Mexico. And because they are exported back to Mexico, workers in Mexico cannot find jobs because the competition is unequal. There is a lot of public support of farmers in Canada, while there isn't that same level of support in Mexico. So through NAFTA earlier and now the new agreement, the competition is definitely unequal. That creates unemployment, which pushes people to come to Canada to work. So it's a perfect system that makes countries like Canada, the United States, and other countries winning twice, really. And the other thing that we often tend to forget when we talk about migration in Canada, mainly in academia, we are actually often talking about immigration in Canada, and much less about global migration and what the mechanism that results in expulsion and displacement, the impact they have in countries of origin. So one example of that, and I'm really happy that at least recently we talk a little bit more about residential schools and what they have meant. We don't talk about the fact that there is an entire generation, or actually multiple generations, as you mentioned, of children who grow up with other parents because their parents have to move. And I have a colleague of ours at Laurier University has this really shocking pictures that the video you showed is one of the many terrible stories that we hear, right? And she has this shocking picture she took in Jamaica of a tombstone of a worker, an agricultural worker who died in Canada. And the tombstone is shaped as a plane, as an airplane, because that's the way the family remembers him, as living on a plane to go and work in Canada. So the kind of impact that these programs have on families and communities and entire society is intergenerational, the same way the impact of residential schools is and has been. And the last thing I wanted to add, it's really interesting at the most recent COP26 in Glasgow. In an interview, Nancy Pelosi was asked why the entire issue of the military is left out of the conversation. The US military apparently produced the CO2 equal to several tenths of entire countries. And her answer was essentially, well, because we are told that climate change is an issue of national security, as you were saying. That means militarizing borders, right? Which is such a, not only such a clear, it shows so clearly that the understanding of what climate change is totally wrong and extremely limited, but also the fact that if we think of climate change as something, as a phenomenon that's going to impact countries in the global south, and we should help, as always, we help them because we are responsible, we miss the fact that literally in this particular case, we are literally all on the same boat. And that's a really dangerous piece to miss. And it is something that we should actually understand. Well, most of the conversation around climate refugees or environmental refugees is the fact that, for example, migration is a form of responding to climate change. We don't say that when we talk about responding, we don't explicitly add the piece as long as they have to move, not us, and as long as they don't move here, because those are fundamental pieces that are always left out of the conversation. So I don't have a specific question, but your conversation, your introduction and your presentation made me think of so many other things that really reinforce what you have said. So thank you again.
There's a question, Harsha. Can you throw light into the struggles of Indigenous land defenders in India and the role of the BJP government in incarcerating them?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. For folks who are unfamiliar, India's BJP government, currently led by Modi, is a completely, by all accounts, fascist government, Hindu fascist government. And that, this isn't, I think it's important to also recognize this isn't specific to Modi, in that Hindutva as an ideology is a deeply Brahminical, fascist, violent ideology that exists parallel to ideologies like Zionism and white supremacy, right? The idea that certain people are inherently belong at the top of a pecking order, which is what these ideologies are about, and that certain people have a right to place and other people don't. And so Hindutva is a deeply violent, casteist, Islamophobic, and really opposed to many, and opposed to the religion, to religious diversity in general, right? Sikhs, Christians, Muslims in particular, Dalits, Adivasis are targeted under Hindutva, and especially escalated under Modi's reign. There's so much more that could be said. Please, really, if you're unfamiliar, it's so important for us to have this transnational understanding of fascism and violence and how it operates. And of course, the ongoing occupation of Kashmir is also being escalated under Modi as well, predates and escalated. And so in terms of the ways in which this targeting happens, is that, these kinds of ethno-nationalist fascist ideologies actually work well with capitalism, right? So Modi has presented his agenda as a pro-business one. So while also being deeply fascistic, it's not actually contrary to capitalism. It works well with capitalist interests. And his, when he first won the elections in India, it was under this banner of rising India and economic development, and, literally pictures of shiny, gentrified, slum dwellers cleared, indigenous lands cleared landscapes. And that is, of course, what is being escalated in Kashmir now as well. And so, the ways in which indigenous land defenders, but really much broader than that, Muslim communities in India, Adivasi communities, Dalit communities, the ongoing occupation of Kashmir has all been escalated under Modi as a dual function of a fascistic Hindutva ideology, and as a result of this kind of like open for business capitalist extractive ideology, right? So both of them have worked in tandem. And one of the ways in which there's so many ways, and there's so, it's also a very large place. So same like Canada, there's just so many struggles going on at the same time. But one of the many is the ways in which defense land defenders who are stopping mega projects like dams have been criminalized. And this has gone on for decades, but has really also again escalated in the current context. So major hydroelectric projects, for example, and land defense has been repressed. And also in the heartland, what's known as the heartland of India, which is also not coincidentally the mining heartland of India, and has now been smeared as the Maoist heartland of India. And so a lot of indigenous communities who are opposing the imposition of export processing zones and really just extractive industry are smeared as Naxalites, as Maoists, and are being repressed. And then most contemporarily is the struggle for farmers, right? Farmers in India who have been battling the Modi government and the BJP when it comes to the right to agriculture, the right to subsistence agriculture, the right to small scale agriculture. The average farmer in India is not a major farmer. They're less than 6 to 60 acres of land. And so, that's another site, not specifically of indigenous land defense, but really of peasant and farming struggles and communities who rely on the land in similar ways. So those are all examples of the ways in which land defense, agricultural security, food security, subsistence level economies are being decimated in the rush to open up to exploitative, extractive mega corporations and industries.
Thank you so much, Harsha. There's another question asking if you can speak to how the pandemic has impacted migrants. That's a big question, and in many different ways.
Yeah, so many ways. Thanks for that question. I think the pandemic has same for all other communities and struggles, right? It's exacerbated the existing fault lines of inequity and inequality. And so for migrants, there are a multitude of struggles. Migrant farm workers, for example, have been a hotspot for the pandemic and of COVID exposure. And so that is not a surprise because, again, that is the nature of that industry. So migrant farm workers are already forced to live in cramped quarters, are not entitled to things like sick days. Like that is the basis, as I mentioned earlier, of that industry, right? It's designed for mass exploitation. And so during the pandemic, we have migrant farm workers living in cramped quarters. We have migrant farm workers who are not being tested for COVID by their employers, who are forced to work even if they're showing symptoms, who are forced to work extremely long days, where there's no PPE equipment. So all of that is like a recipe for disaster, the same way that it was in prisons. And so one of the hot spots amongst many in Canada throughout the pandemic has been in places like farm work, right? So, and also a number of deaths from COVID have been of migrant farm workers, and particularly, not exclusively, but particularly in Ontario. And so, that's one of the realities. The same was true for a lot of live-in caregivers. So domestic workers who are also forced to live with your employer. Like, we're all told that we have to stay in place, shelter in place, and your entire job does not allow that. And in fact, your job is to shelter in place with your employer, regardless of your circumstance, right? And so that was the case for domestic workers who weren't able to take time off, who had to work through COVID, who had to live in the home of their employer. And that's specifically migrant workers. For a lot of migrant communities, immigrant communities at large, we also know that in major urban cities, a lot of low income racialized communities were also a COVID hotspot, and the danger of some of that data, and this is a question of race-based, disaggregated data, is data can be a weapon, right? And so in some quarters, of course, that data became a weapon for like really biological essentialist kind of arguments, right? Like, are these people more susceptible to COVID? And in some spheres of white supremacist organizing, it really buttressed the arguments of white supremacists. So I don't know, a lot of in the Freedom Convoy, I don't know how much people went down that rabbit hole. If you were like me, hopefully you protected yourself from that. But I went deep down that rabbit hole. And there was a lot of ways in which white supremacy, as has always been used, was really being used in these kind of biological determinist ways, right? Like that the white race is going to reproduce after COVID because we will somehow not be as susceptible. And look, we don't have the rates that immigrant communities do of COVID, which somehow proves that white people are the chosen race, right? Sorry for regurgitating this white supremacist rhetoric. It's evil and violent, but just so that people understand the ways in which this becomes connected, right? And how data gets weaponized by hate, by white supremacist hate. But the reality, of course, is that, low-income and racialized communities were hardest hit by COVID, not because of these ridiculous arguments put forward by white supremacists, but because of the social conditions of the pandemic, right? More likely to live in dense neighborhoods, more likely to have inadequate access to housing, more likely to have to commute to work, less likely to be able to work from home, more likely to be working in the healthcare system as janitors, as support services, more likely to be working in grocery stores, more likely to be, again, picking and feeding us, right? To be doing the essential work. So that was another struggle in immigrant communities. And then, of course, the general lack of access to information in multiple languages, right? Like the overall ways in which the pandemic was handled and continues to be handled means that not everybody has access to be supporting themselves the way that they need to be for various reasons. We also had the issue where the pandemic, in places where criminalizing responses to the pandemic were utilized, where, for example, fining people or curfews, like in Quebec, there were stories of disproportionately and data showing that disproportionately Black and Indigenous and racialized people were more likely to be fined during the pandemic where there was criminalizing responses. Or in the case of Quebec, where, if I'm understanding this correctly, folks can correct me, the whole story I wasn't able to discern completely in terms of access to reading English material on it. But there was, in some cases, and in one case even a death of a homeless person who wasn't able to access a shelter in Quebec as a result of both the curfew and also restrictions in the pandemic, right, where there was just fewer and fewer spaces for people to access indoors. There's also the issue, the final point I'll make, during the pandemic, for refugees in particular, is that the border shut down, right? So suddenly movement, certain kinds of movement is being criminalized because we're told to stay at home. While of course capital is flowing, right? We know that many people are vacationing during this pandemic, right? So the ways in which those same kinds of forms of power circulate, right? So people with money, people with access, as we know in some cases, even politicians in Canada were vacationing while they were imposing mandates on people. But refugees whose travel is essential, right, who are fleeing for their safety, who are fleeing for their life, faced a militarized, shutdown, closed border, and were unable to access safety in Canada. While, again, not coincidentally, so, flights bringing people in were shut down for refugees, but deportation flights expelling people out of the country did not stop. So in the US, for example, in the first few months of the pandemic, about 1/4 of the cases of COVID in Honduras and Guatemala were coming from deportation flights. 1/4 of their cases were traced back to flights deporting people out of the United States, right? So while refugees can't come in because supposedly it's not safe and it's not essential, deportation flights were able to still happen. And flights bringing migrant workers in who were necessary to maintain our food supply chains were able to come in, right? So the pandemic exposes the porousness of the border, right? That the border works in the interests of some and works against the interests of others by design and by intention.
The final question that we have from Samir is a wonderful way to end this. So you've eloquently highlighted the impacts of racial capitalism and colonialism on Indigenous peoples and migrants, including in healthcare. Despite the challenging and bleak times we are in, what ideas and movements inspire you to build a healthier and just world?
Thanks for that question, Samir. Samir is one of many who inspires me. I think, maybe a few things that I'll offer is one thing that's incredibly inspiring to me right now is the degree to which those of us who are thinking about justice in the world are thinking how justice really needs to be for every single person, right? Like we're thinking internationally, we're thinking about how so many different communities are impacted, perhaps not in the same way, but that these forms of violence are interconnected, they're constituted through each other, and that we can't throw any community under the bus, that we can have no easy victories, and that we really need to be thinking about collective liberation, about revolution. I use the term revolution not lightly, but I mean it, right? That we need to be thinking about transforming the system. And that is a refreshing change from, years and decades of, conservative and neoliberal ideology that is like, we can just tweak the system. We can just make it a little bit better, which is not to say that we don't need to also fight for material victories in the kind of short term, in the immediate, but that we're doing it with a much wider, more expansive horizon. And for me, I'm actually propelled by that, even though that is not as attainable. To me, I feel much more inspired personally by fights that are emancipatory. I don't feel inspired by like change your light bulb this Earth Day. I find that completely demoralizing, right? But I find it so much more liberating when people are like, no, can we dismantle the military industrial complex that's destroying the earth? Can we open the borders? Even though that's not happening today, I can change my light bulb today. I can't open the borders today, but I feel so much more in struggle alongside people. So the ideas that I find inspiring are the ones that are expansive. And even though they seem utopic, the kind of ideology of incrementalism is still a deathscape. There is nothing empowering about still living in incrementalism when it still means death for people, when it still means premature death for people, right? But if there is a horizon, even if it is not near, even if it is far away, but where there is the possibility of liberation and freedom for all people, that is so much more inspiring. And I invite all of us to think about, what are the movements that have inspired us over time? And I will bet that it is the ones that seemed so deeply radical for their time, right? Like no one's going to remember those smaller reformist strategies of like, the liberals changed the electoral system. No one remembers that, right? But we remember movements like Idle No More because they changed the landscape of how we think, of Black Lives Matter, of Occupy, of whatever movements they are, right? Of BDS, whatever it is, or historical movements, less contemporary ones. Those are the ones that have inspired us. Those are the ones that change the way we think about the world, that change about the way we understand ourselves in relationship to the world, that change the ways in which we are in relation to each other. So those are the kinds of ideas and the movements that represent those ideas. There are so many. Those are the ones that inspire me. Right now, abolitionist movements are in a resurgence, anti-capitalist movements, the Amazon victory of this week, right? Like all of these are so deeply inspiring. And I think because they show us the possibility of freedom. And I think it is so important to hold on to that because it can also be really fatalistic to be like, nothing's ever going to change. The reality is we're living the fruits of the victories of so many social movements. And it is our responsibility to be the kind of future ancestors that creates more of those possibilities for those who come after us. So those are the kinds of things that inspire me.
Thank you, Harsha. That is a really powerful call to action for all of us. And thank you for such a brilliant talk, weaving together these threads of how of the violence of our borders and the injustice that they perpetrate, and our responsibility in changing these systems of oppression. So thank you so much for sharing your time with all of us and your wisdom. And I'll just turn to Andrea if he has any closing comments.
I can just add my thank you. It was a wonderful way of starting these lectures that are just one of many things that are happening at the University of Toronto, trying to, I think, focus on radical rethinking of the worldview that has been so dominant over the past several centuries. And I couldn't agree more in terms of being inspired by expansive ideas. Those are the only one worth being inspired by, I think. As an educator, I also think a lot about my responsibility as an educator, teaching, more than teaching, learning or sharing with young people at the time of ecological and social mayhem that we observe today. And these are questions that are asked more and more often everywhere. I agree with you that the only way to go is to go trying to change things and fighting, if we want to use for a more just world. I don't think there is really any alternative way to think the future at this point. So thank you so much, Harsha, and to thank you all who were here today. I really hope everybody agrees that these were a couple of hours worth sharing.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thanks a lot. And somebody's mentioning so inspirational, and I completely agree.